We're going live. And we are waiting for people to show up. Everybody's coming. Welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, hello.
Yeah, this is great. I'm gonna pour my bottle of wine since I was not as proactive as Marshall and Jonathan here. But I'm gonna start out by saying cheers, everybody. Welcome to the second of the Yakima Valley Vineyard tours. And today we are focusing on DuBrul Vineyard. And so one of the things that we want to do is go back to that map of the Yakima Valley and look at, oh wait, I should start by, for anybody who wasn't here last week, I'm Carrie Shields from DuBrul Vineyard in the middle of the Yakima Valley. I'm also the moderator, so I have everybody's photos. Then we have Marshall Edwards from Quintessence and Jonathan Sauer from Red Willow. If you missed John's feature on Red Willow last week, it's on YouTube, so you can go back and watch the video. He tells the best stories, so you definitely want to go do that. And then next week, we're going to do the deep dive on Quintessence with Marshall, so you'll definitely want to tune in again next week because Marshall is always incredibly knowledgeable, and we always learn lots of things listening to him. So I am hoping to tap into both of their knowledge this week because John talked a lot about the history and the stories of the Yakima Valley, and I want to focus a little bit more on diversity because I think DuBrul Vineyard is a wonderful example of what makes the Yakima Valley so unique and interesting. So the first thing we're going to do is look at the valley from the air and talk a little bit about where we're at. Now, we did, if you spin the globe around, as Jonathan tells much more eloquently than I do, you get, the Yakima Valley is in this perfect latitude. It's in between Burgundy and Bordeaux, right smack dab in the middle. So we get very, very long days. We can tell right now the days are getting longer and longer. Every day I start thinking, I look outside, the sun's setting, I say, oh, it must be this time. And every day right now, this time of year, it is later than I think it is because every day the sun sets that much later during the day. It's really, this is one of my favorite times of year for that because the days get longer, the vineyard's growing, there's so much life right now in the valley. And we're in this, not only are we in this latitude band, but you can see from the satellites, one of the things that makes our valley so unique and different, which is the fact that it's so dry. I mean, in the Yakima Valley, we have irrigation, we use this snow melt from the Cascades to grow all of these wonderful crops that we grow. And then as soon as you get outside of those irrigation districts, it's sagebrush. And that means we can manage our water, we can manage our growth. We have so much more control. And you really are going to see this when we get into the pictures of where the individual vineyards are at. But to highlight and set the stage, we have Red Willow over here on the very western end of the valley. DuBrul is right there, smack dab in the middle. And then Red Mountain is all the way over here on the eastern end of the valley. And so there are a lot of things that are very similar between the vineyards and the sites, and there's a lot of things that are different enough to make really interesting, unique nuances. But the key takeaways of the whole valley is this east-west trending valley, which is unique in the world. I mean, most valleys run north-south. So if you're on one side of the river, you get the morning sun, and the other side of the river, you get the afternoon sun. And there's so many north-south facing slopes here that are on northern hillsides that get sun all day long. So they get to take advantage of all this photosynthesis and all the sunlight that we have right now. And that's really a special feature of our valley that not many places in the world can lay claim to. DuBrul Vineyard is a basalt rocky upthrust. These hills were all upthrust due to tectonic plate movement millennia ago. And DuBrul's in an interesting spot. I'll show you some pictures of No, I lost them. Now I lost them. Well, I'm going to let Jonathan tell you one quick thing about red willow while I find them. Go ahead, John.
Well, maybe I can expand on the hills a little bit, Carrie. I think it's about 90 miles in length, so it's a huge area. And I think last week you mentioned if you took Napa Valley and put it in north-south, it would fit in the valley. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's amazing. I never heard that before, and it just kind of illustrates how big this valley is. And but it's not the valley that we grow the grapes. It's like Carrie said, it's up on the hills, and it's this elevation range of 600 feet up to, I don't know, 1,500, or maybe there's vineyard higher than that now. But it's kind of that unique band going along this ridge line. I guess a little bit about Red Willow. We're the furthest western vineyard. I kind of talked a lot about it last week. We're just one of the pioneering vineyards for the state. Began in the 70s. Pioneered a lot of varieties. We're pretty isolated way out there. Unique soils, and I think it's going to be really interesting to try the Carriage House this week, and we tried Red Willow last week, and then Marshall's down Red Mountain. Even though we're all in the same valley, I think it's going to really showcase just how diverse and just how the wines really can be very, very different, but very good at the same time.
Thanks, John. So I found my photos, and as Jonathan was saying, all of the vineyards are on these hillsides. So DuBrul Vineyard is on this basalt promontory, this upthrust, and we have Syrah in this block that comes from Red Willow Vineyard. And one of the really fascinating things, again, is DuBrul is a great teaching vineyard because we have these south-facing slopes. This image is from the top of the hill looking to the south. And so we have this steep south-facing hillside that gets sun all day long. We have Cabernet planted here. It's a little more gentle. The heat accumulation when you're on a hill versus a little bit more gentle is pretty different over the course of the growing season. So we have Merlot planted in this part of the hill. And then down here we have Cabernet. And in this little corner we have Cabernet Franc. And the Carriage House that we're drinking, hopefully enjoying, comes from this part of the vineyard. And so I think one of the things that's really unique about what we do at Côte Bonneville is we take these two parts of the hill and these two parts of the vineyard and we separate them and carry that variation and that nuance all the way through from the vineyard to the bottle. And kind of what I want to do today is focus on, we talk about all these things, like we talk about the difference in geology, we talk about the difference in soil profiles, we talk about the difference in heat accumulation. But what does that mean when it comes to what's really important as not only a grower, but as a winemaker? What does that mean when it gets into your glass? Because at the end of the day, we're not drinking the rocks, we're drinking the wine. And so that is, I mean, it's an important point. And if you are a winemaker like myself, you get to taste the nuance and the variation of what does this block of the vineyard taste like versus this block versus, for example, the grapes in Red Willow, the grapes in Quintessence, and then if you ferment them all the same way, what does that mean? Many times those all get blended together, either in Washington State wines, Columbia Valley wines, Cabernet in general, and you lose that distinctiveness and that sense of place. And again, there's some macros that make the average quality of the Yakima Valley very high, but what's really distinctive and cool about any region are always those distinctive, unique, exceptional vineyards. And that's what we've got with these three sites that we're talking about here. And so we have, down here I mentioned we have Cabernet Franc. And we have a little bit of Cab Franc there because one of the other reasons that we're up on the hillsides in the Yakima Valley is for frost protection. And you can see from our vineyard, it goes cold air. I think you mentioned this last week, John. Cold air is like water. And if you were pouring a giant pitcher of water at the top of the hill, it's going to flow down, and moving air is warmer than stationary air. So it's going to flow down and keep going farther and farther off into the hillside, except in this one little spot, which is probably where things are going to, if the air is going to stay anywhere and get trapped, it's going to be where we have the Cabernet Franc planted. And we have it there because it's the most cold hardy varietal of all of the varieties that we grow. And it really helps us with our frost and disease protection, because we're kind of at the edge of where you can grow grapes in terms of late season freezes in the spring and early season frosts in the fall. And so that the choice of grapes that we plant are very dependent. They should be dependent on your site, because one of the key factors for making quality wines and growing quality grapes is planting the grapes that are well suited to the site and the aspect that you're growing them in. And so also very unique to DuBrul, it's a hillside, but there's a cutout over here on the west side. It's like a hand, and over on this side, there's a divot that goes down and up again. So we actually have at DuBrul, we have Chardonnay in this part of the vineyard, which is north facing. And then in this part of the vineyard, where the Syrah is that came from Red Willow, it's west-southwest. So it's an intermediate exposure. It gets intermediate heat accumulation. And up at the top of the hill here, we have Riesling. And these are the oldest Riesling vines, some of the oldest Riesling vines in the state. They go back to the early 80s. But it's such a unique thing, because I don't know anywhere else in the world where you can grow world-class Riesling, Chardonnay, Cabernet, and Syrah, and other Bordeaux varietals as well, so close to each other. I mean, those all come up, they're adjacent blocks, and they're all world-class. And you just can't do that in very many places in the world. And that's one of the things that I think is really unique and special about DuBrul. And I forget how many varietals. We grow 6 varietals. We do the Cab Merlot, Cab Franc, Riesling, Syrah, and Chardonnay. Marshall and John, how many varietals do you guys grow?
Go ahead, Marshall.
So you guys have to realize that we're a larger grower. So I looked to see, and it even surprised me, but we grow 23 different varietals, and 20 of them we do grow on Red Mountain. So a lot of the port varieties, we have the port varieties. I have Counois, Tempranillo, Grenache, some of the small, but I have all of the big varieties too. I grow Chardonnay, Riesling, a lot of Cabernet, Syrah, Merlot. But yeah, we grow a wide variety of fruit, and it is kind of amazing what you say, Carrie, that we can grow all of that fruit in one region, like even Red Mountain. That's this small AVA. I've got 20 of those varieties growing, even Sauv Blanc, and in the lower part of the vineyard. That is just world class, right next to a block that's Cabernet that's just fantastic. And so it's really interesting, the things that we can do in the valley that a lot of places in the world can't.
Yeah, I think we grow about 16 or 17 varieties. I've got to count them. And kind of true to our name, we're mostly reds, but in the white end, we have Riesling, Gewurz, Viognier, Chardonnay. Just got into that again. Just matching the variety with even the little location in the vineyard is important, but it takes time to kind of figure that out. And a lot of years we've kind of, over the years, you planted something and say, well, maybe we should have put it over there, So it's right now some old blocks of cab that had a lot of just leaf roll. We're kind of removing those and putting a different variety in. It's like, I think it's better suited for that hill, that specific hill. So yeah, grow a lot of different things. For the most part, don't have trouble ripening it. So
yeah,
I think that's the benefit. That's the benefit that I think that we've had on Red Mountain, is that for our vineyards are fairly young, so we've benefited from your dad's mistakes. That they decided where they planted things back then. A lot of the stuff that was planted wasn't planted in the right spot. So we've really benefited from everybody's knowledge in the past to be able to make sure that we're putting Cabernet where it should be, and Cab Franc where it should be, and Sauv Blanc and Chardonnay, and yeah, it's been a huge benefit for me in my vineyard career. So.
Yeah. Adrish, you ask if we study airflow patterns, temperature profiles before we decide what to plant. And I think the answer to that, definitely from when it was the early part of the industry where people were just experimenting, I think as always, you're going to get some growers who say, sideways happened. Nobody wants Merlot anymore. Everybody wants Pinot. So they're going to rip out Merlot and plant Pinot. I mean, you're always going to get some people who are chasing markets and chasing trends. But I think the key about your better sites and your better growers are they're going to plant the things that grow well. And part of that is digging soil pits when you plant and planting the right varietals. Some of that, you can study all you want. You can measure all of the temperature patterns. We have the weather stations that go back with data for years. What is the weather like in this site? And you can do the best you can, but it really, there's nothing that compensates for experience and knowing your site. And I think that's one of the other advantages to the Yakima Valley within Washington State, is because we have more multi-generational growers. We have more families that know that land. And even if it was something different before, they know those things. They know the temperature, they know the airflow patterns, they know those things. And then I think as a winemaker, you know those things when you live the season through your vines. We sell fruit all over the state, there are people who buy fruit and ship it to other parts of the country to make wine out of. And I think as a winemaker, it's a huge advantage to live here and live the season with our vines, because I know it was a warm summer. I know when the heat came, and I don't know it from watching temperature graphs. I know it from living it with the grapes, and just that being exposed to the same temperature, the same wind patterns, the same season, and then being able to go and be in the vineyard all the time tasting. But I think that's also a good contrast to what Marshall does, because we're a good broad benchmark of the industry. We are the smallest by far. DuBrul Vineyard is 45 acres under vine. And although we sell to about a dozen or more wineries, we also make about 2,500, 3,000 cases every year. So we're very small, boutique, very family oriented. John, I think you said you've got 150 acres?
About 150, yeah.
So you're
Right.
three times the size of us. And Marshall, how many acres do you farm?
So Shaw's is a little over 3,000 acres, and then I manage another 1,500 acres for other people through a management company that I partners in. So about 4,500 acres of wine grapes that I manage in a lot of different AVA, a lot of different areas. But to their question too, Carrie, though, with us with the new plantings that we've been doing and new areas where we've been going, whether it be up clear down on Horse Heaven or other areas where we haven't been, we put out temperature monitors to monitor the temperatures through the winter. We put them out all over the place. We're digging soil pits. We're to lay out the blocks and the irrigation system with, but we use a lot of that data just to make sure, even though we have a good idea of what we want to plant, but to make sure that the things that we're doing, that we're making a good decision on what we're planting.
Yeah, which is really important, because these are very long-term decisions. Yeah. And I mean, I lost track of the times that I did a harvest in Argentina and came back and got asked, are we going to start making Malbec? And I'm like, but we didn't plant Malbec. So even if I wanted to, and we planted something today, it would be 3 years before you get a crop, 2 years before you get the final wines. It'd be 5 years to do the whole process the first time, but it takes way longer than that for your vines to mature. So getting that data, making those good decisions that are informed by data and experience and boots on the ground is really, it's really important to quality fruit. So one of the things that is also kind of interesting as we go around the valley is, and like I said, looking at what's the same and what's different. I asked you guys, so right now everything's growing a lot and the vineyards are really active, and we have some pictures of Cabernet that were taken yesterday. And this one, the before picture, this is kind of where the vines are at. Everything's growing, they're really moving, they're kind of bushy. So we went through, the next thing we're going to do in the vineyard is open those up, get the spacing, get the light, so we can see what it looks like after we go through and shoot thin. And we can talk a little bit more about why we do this stuff in a minute, but this is what most of the Cabernet in DuBrul looks like right now. And then I asked Marshall and John for pictures, and these pictures you guys sent me were from this week, right?
Yeah.
Yesterday.
Yep.
So this is quintessence.
Oh no, that one isn't Carrie. Sorry.
Okay,
that
I was
was-
like, really?
yeah.
That's
It's like,
surprising.
wow.
No. Let's see.
There's Red Willow. So have you guys
No,
gone
it was
through and shoot thinned already?
It was the first group of pictures that I sent you.
Oh, I'll have to go back and find that. Because, well, this is what we're
You
getting
can-
to.
you-
We're getting
you
to
can see
about
the
half
wind.
canopy.
You can see the wind in my picture. You
Yeah,
must not have,
Yeah, that was yesterday.
you can see the shoots kind of. Yeah.
yeah, mine was from the morning, so it wasn't quite, they weren't quite so crazy. But, well, Marshall, how do your grapes compare to these?
Yeah, we're probably a little bit ahead of this. If you look at, and you can really see the difference between the top of quintessence and the bottom of quintessence. Our shoots are probably maybe an inch or two longer than right there, what I'm looking at Red Willow right now. We've been shoot thinning for a little over a week now. We're about halfway done on Red Mountain. So I've got about 250 acres done, and we should finish by the end of next week. We should finish shoot thinning, hopefully by the end of next week is our plan. So, but yeah, it's too bad he didn't have those pictures carried. I'm sorry, I confused you sending you a bunch of pictures, but yeah, there's a big difference between a little over 1,000 feet at quintessence, and then you go down to 650 feet elevation at the lower part of the vineyard, and you can see the difference in the shoot growth, just from the hillside down to more of the flat area. But we're not a lot different though.
No, they're all about I'm actually surprised. They're all about, phenologically, they're about the same. Joyce, to your question of is that a drip line? Yes, John was talking last week about how they are far enough out away from civilization that the coyotes come in, and if they have the drip lines, the drip tubes down lower, the coyotes will come eat them. And so they have them elevated up higher than everybody else. You can see, for contrast, you can see if we go back to the DuBrul photos, the drip lines are down here. They're at this level.
That's really observant. I think we're the only ones that I know of that does that. So
I mean,
works all right.
again, even if things are kind of similar, because we're not that far apart, these nuances and differences, and there is no amount of data that you can collect ahead of time to tell you how many coyotes are going to come down and eat your drip. You just have to know your site.
Actually, at harvest time, we don't have a lot of birds. We're not by a river or anything, but probably our biggest thing is coyotes. They come and they'll chew up some of the clusters and stuff, like try to chase them off.
Oh my goodness. And we have birds. We have so many birds.
Have birds. Yeah.
Yeah.
So our vineyards, we don't even net.
Wow.
So we just
some of
the outlying areas will net, because that's kind of where they'll start and they'll move in from there. So we kind of know where the hot spots are. But yeah. So
yeah, we have to net, because down here, these are orchards. Over here, These are more apples. And we have a lot of birds that hang out in the apple trees. And as soon as the grapes are ripe, they'll come in, and if we didn't net, we would not have a crop. We have to net everything because the birds come in and eat so much. And we actually have a section that we call the bird because it ripens faster than the others in the area. And you can always tell when Verasion's coming because that's when the birds come in and will eat that section of the grapes. So it's how ripening,
The prevailing wind goes down the valley, so we kind of just shoo them down your guys' direction.
Thanks.
Well, I think Carrie's keeping them because we don't have to net yet, so that's pretty good. We have a few bird problems just from some of the power lines that they'll land on and do some damage on some outside rows, but thank goodness
great.
We don't have to net the vineyard. That's
a lot of work.
A lot of work. Yeah.
It is. And then after we net, so we net at Verasion, which is the middle of the growing season. The first half of the season, which we're in right now, we're growing canopy, we're growing shoots. The clusters are little itty bitty. They're just developing. In about a month, we'll have bloom and the berries will flower and will pollinate. And then from that point, the berries are growing and that's the reproductive part of the plant. So the strategy of the plant then is to grow that berry and really develop the seed. And after the seed coats are hardened and the seeds are ready to be dispersed, the strategy of the plant changes from acid and tannins and hard fruit, which are all sending signals to the birds and maybe the coyotes. And I don't know who you're keeping away, Marshall, but somebody, I'm sure. The plant is telling the birds and the coyotes, don't eat me, stay away, I'm not ready. And then as soon as the seed coats are hardened, strategy of the plant changes. We call it verasion. That's when the grapes get purple. If they're purple or more golden as opposed to hard green, if they're white grapes, they start to soften, they get sweeter, the acidity goes down, and they get flavor development and start sending all the signals to the birds, the coyotes, and the winemakers, hey, it's time to come pick me, come disperse the seed and make more grapes. And so the really fascinating thing in our site is because it's warmer and rockier here than it is down here, this ripens faster. So we'll see bud break here sooner, which happens based on soil temperature. And this part of the vineyard is a rocky basalt promontory. I have a picture of some rocks because I love my rocks. And I meant to bring rocks, but instead I have a picture. You can see we have all sorts of river rocks that were tumbled by the ancient Columbia River when it came down through our property, mixed with volcanic basalt that's black. And all these different rocks came from, there's calcium carbonate from when the river would flow and dry up and flow and dry up. It left this white mineral crust on the rocks in that hillside part of the vineyard, which is completely, totally different than when you get down in this part of the vineyard where the carriage house is. And this is it's in a floodplain. So there's 40,000 acres of that dry hillside of the Rattlesnake Ridge above us that drains down into this part of the vineyard. So when you get a lot of water up here, if we get a lot of rainfall up in these hills, it will come through and drain down into here. So over the millennia, it doesn't happen often, but over the millennia, we've had flooding events from higher in the hills down into this part of the vineyard. And that's brought more cobblestones, smaller flood-size water-carried rocks that are very different. And so the flavors between these two things, between these two plantings, are very different. But in general, DuBrul, I think, is characterized, especially the carriage house block, it's characterized by really soft tannins and wonderfully expressive aromatics. And all of the reds have this really distinctive DuBrul cherry. And I think this is, again, the fun thing about about wine is the nuances that you get from DuBrul and the nuances you get from Red Willow and the nuances you get from Red Mountain are all very different. So we use DuBrul Cherry all the time. John, how would you describe, what would be your word for Red Willow?
Oh, it depends on the winery. You know, are they early picker, late picker, whatever. Just in general, which I think all three of our vineyards would be wines that age. So I think they would age very well. We have a lot of tannin, but it's more that softer tannin, like you're describing, Carrie. Red Willow tends to have a really good middle palate. It just kind of I don't know. A lot of times you get a wine and it's kind of missing that middle, and it's usually there in Red Willow. A lot of fruit, maybe more of a little more towards the old world-ish in the style. I don't know. Wines of elegance, I guess. I'm not a good winemaker or sommelier, so that's kind of how I would describe it, I guess.
I think you have a great point with texture. Red Willow wines have very distinctive textural components that are very notable.
Mm-hmm.
Marshall, how would you characterize Red Willow or Red Mountain? Sorry.
So Red Mountain, and I think it's Red Mountain in all, but Quintessence too, especially, it's got big ripe fruit. And it's very concentrated flavor profiles. They're really the fruit is very concentrated, and also these wines, because it's such a hot site. These wines, and really it's Cabernet because that's the majority that's grown up there. They're big, bold, tannic. You have to, the winemakers that aren't used to working with that fruit, it takes them a little bit to understand how to work with that fruit, because those wines can be, if you're not careful, can be so tannic, big and bold, and so you really have to learn how to work with that fruit and to be able to soften those tannins, I think. But yeah, just big ripe fruit is really.
Yeah, and I think if we contrast that to DuBrul, and I've never vinified fruit from Red Mountain, but I would think it's the same, or it's similar from the standpoint that we have enough structure to age these wines, but they don't. I actually didn't have any of the current vintage of Carriage House at home, which I realized at 5 o'clock. So I found a bottle of 2008 Carriage House, and
Nice.
It's just, I mean, it's got that sweet spot. It's got enough structure. It's aging beautifully. I didn't have to open this tonight. I could have kept it in my cellar for another 10 years probably. But so it's got enough structure to age. But even when these wines are young, especially from the Carriage House block, they're soft. They're more like the iron fist in a velvet glove, where they're never going to overpower you, which I like, because I don't like the kind of wines that, this wine's going to punch you in the face. I don't really want to have dinner with anything that's going to punch me in the face. Call me crazy. I like the kind of wines that you can have a conversation with over the course of the bottle. And I think that that to get those kind of bottles out of Red Mountain, you have to vinify them very differently than you do the grapes that come out of DuBrul or come out of Red Willow. And it's actually really interesting to see. Structure is one of the main differences we get in the two blocks of the vineyard. We get higher tannin, we get higher phenolic levels, we get more color that comes out of the hillside block, where it has more, it has less soil, it gets more heat accumulation. And yet, on the flip side, in this block down below, the aromatics are just so bright and so lovely. And so it's really as a winemaker, what are you looking for? How are you going to express that site to bring out the aromatics? And again, I think the aromatics all around DuBrul are just really notable and remarkable. What makes a vineyard produce age-worthy wines? That's an excellent question.
Yeah.
I think it's a couple things. I mean, you have to have the intent to make age-worthy wines, I think. You can take great grapes and make them in a way that is not intended to be age-worthy, and your wines aren't going to last that long. So a lot of it goes into, you have to but you need, a lot of it is the winery, but a lot of it in the vineyard, you need structure, and in red wines, you need a certain amount of tannin. You also need acidity. And one of the things that is really unique, and one of the things that's really interesting about the geology of the Yakima Valley, all of Eastern Washington, if we go back to that picture of the whole valley and the whole state, you can see all of the upthrusts, and those are basalt. I mean, before all those upthrusts happened, there were just lava flows that came out of these fissures in the earth and covered everything with lava. So we have 14,000 feet of basalt as our bedrock all over the valley, all over the eastern part of the state and into Oregon. And we talk at lower elevations, that's covered by sediment from the Missoula floods. At higher elevations, you have less of that. We have areas where the Columbia River went through on top of the basalt. But all of our underlying, the less soil you have and the more basalt you have, the lower your pHs are and the higher your acidity is. And acid is one of the key drivers for making age-worthy wines. So you can get that from picking sooner, because one of the things that happens during ripening is your acid in the grapes it diminishes. So if you pick earlier, you get more acidity. If you pick later, you get riper flavors. And in a place like ours, where there's very thin soils, even with riper grapes, you still retain the acidity. You still have low pH. You still have healthy wines. You get less microbial spoilage, and you need that acidity for aging. And it really helps to have healthy grapes and good growers, because if your grapes come in, if you have a lot of disease, if you have a lot of rot, if you have birds that come in and eat everything, you have microbial issues. And it's much, much harder in the winery if you have to solve problems. If you can get your grapes perfectly ripe with great acidity, great flavors, good structure, and they're clean and healthy, it's so much easier as a winemaker to do that. I mean, if you think about taking your food from the farm and then taking it into the restaurant, if you give the chef the best produce, they don't have to work so hard to make the best food. If you give them average produce, you got to work really hard to make good food. And a great chef can do it. A great chef can elevate their ingredients, but even the best chefs are never going to get the best results without the best grapes. And that comes back to one of the reasons that if we go back to shoot thinning, why are we shoot thinning? We are shoot thinning to get airflow, to get sunlight. We'll go back to those pictures for a second, because they're really, if we look at the before, you can see how many clusters we have. This is a baby cluster, that's a baby cluster, that's a baby cluster. And all of these shoots they'll have clusters, they'll have yield. If you're growing for yield, they're not going to have any sunlight in there. They're not going to have any airflow. So when you don't have sunlight and airflow on Cabernet, which all these grapes are Cabernet that we've been showing, you get green flavors. You get your methoxypyrs, your green peppers when you don't have enough sunlight. You don't have airflow, so you have more mildew, which makes your grapes taste funny. You get more disease pressure with more pests and all sorts of things. So if your grower isn't good enough to go, or isn't paying attention enough to go through and open everything up so it looks like this grape, this part of the vine will have the airflow, will have the light penetration, will have less yield, but with less yield, you get more intensity, because at this point, the vines will have a certain capacity to ripen everything. And they'll put more attention and flavors into fewer clusters. It's kind of like if you have 10 kids, you don't really have enough time to pay attention to all of them. If you only have one or two, you can put more attention. Sorry, John, your wife's a rock star. John's got a lot of kids.
We don't have 10 kids. Divide by 2.
If you have a couple, you can take the same amount of time and put it to just those couple, and with grapes, you get better flavors, you get more intensity, you get more complexity. we can also keep the berries really small with the fact that we control the water, and that also leads into flavor, complexity, intensity, and all of those things that you want for age-worthy wines. Because if your wine's not great, you're not going to age it anyway. Because why would you? It takes up space in your cellar for something like Carriage House. All right, do we have any more questions, you guys, that I've missed? I think we're doing okay. So the yeah, I think there's a lot of, I don't know, did I miss them? No, I got them all. So yeah, I think one of the things that is really, it's fascinating how you can make these age-worthy wines from different sites and different nuances and different complexities, and it's really special that now as an industry we're starting to see, well, we have been seeing for the last 10 or 15 years more winemakers who say, I'm not just making Cabernet, I'm making Quintessence Cabernet, I'm making Red Willow Cabernet, I'm making DuBrul Cabernet. Because as we look, as wine lovers, if you want to get to the grape and learn how all these things translate through, it helps to know where your grapes come from. It helps to know where your sites come from. And like I said, there are a lot of similarities around the Yakima Valley, but there are a lot of differences. One thing,
Carrie, I think what's interesting about with Cabernet is that not only the fruit, but just the clones of Cabernet, the differences now that as wineries are making it with vineyard specific like Quintessence, but just the clones itself, the difference in all the clones of Cabernet that are out there, that we grow quite a few different clones, and that wineries are now even specifically putting the clone of Cab on the bottle. Now I've got some wineries that are doing that people are interested, so that they know they're tasting not just a Cabernet, but they're tasting a clone 169 Cabernet. It's really interesting, and it's fun when we do these clonal tastings, because and it's all Cabernet, but you can really taste the difference in the flavor profiles of that Cabernet.
yeah, I think too, if we look at because we keep talking about Cabernet, it is important to remember something that Marshall wanted to point out. Age-worthy wines are also available in white. Because of the white varietals that we grow Chardonnay and we grow Riesling, and similar to the reds, those both have great acidity and they will age because of the acidity. And I've got a bottle that we're going to open this weekend for Mother's Day, and although I did bring it back from the Mosel when I went to the Mosel last year, it was only a year ago, it's hard to believe. I brought back a bottle of, I think it's 1976 Riesling, a Beerenauslese level Riesling from the Mosel, which we made a Beerenauslese level Riesling in 2009. So I keep an eye out for that ripeness designation. But again, what makes those wines age? Acidity. And I also think, Marshall, this is a great way for social distancing, because right, as they say, masks are really, really important. If yours happens to have wine in it, that's really great.
Yeah, Carrie, that's funny. We bought 2 bottles of Riesling when we were in Germany on the Mosel, and they told us to buy 2, to drink one when we get home, and then put the other one away for 10 years. So we've got one we're putting away. We drank the one, and we're putting the other one away for 10 years. They said it'll be just as good 10 years later.
Excellent.
Yeah,
I believe that. Adrish asked about the yields. We get about 2 tons per acre in most of the vineyard. It's a little bit higher in the Carriage House block because we have a little more soil, but like 3. So what do you guys get, John Marshall?
I think some of our real old blocks, we were down to that 210 to the acre. And our medium blocks are in the 3. a little bit more. And then our younger blocks, which tend to be a little denser planting, those are 3.5 to 3 3/4. That's generally our range. It kind of depends on the target and what the wineries are looking for as well. So.
Yeah, that's kind of us. It's kind of what the winery is looking for. You know, I've got some wineries that want to be down around that 3 tons.
Yeah.
I kind of think our sweet spot is about 3.75 really is kind of what we shoot for the most part across the vineyard. But yeah, we're in that 3.5, and sometimes it just depends with cluster weights, but we could be closer to 4, but we're really for about 3.5 to 3.75.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, well, like I was saying, it depends on how much soil you have in the blocks of the vineyard, and we also we give our winemakers a choice of if they want to go down to 1 cluster per shoot across the block and try to get more intensity and more concentration. But again, you give up yields if with every shoot you only have 1 cluster, or our other option is to go by what we call Zelma's rules, because we learned it from Zelma Long, which is if your shoots are really short, then they don't carry any crop. If they're intermediate, they'll get 1 cluster, but if they're long enough and healthy enough and you have enough leaf surface area to ripen the fruit, they'll go up to 2 clusters per shoot. So if you're in a block that has good canopy development, you could be cutting your yields in half if the winemaker wants to go to 1 cluster per shoot. And so we have to balance that off with how much we're charging, but we give the winemakers that choice of, do you want, what are you really looking for? Where's that trade-off for you in terms of cost benefit, and how much is the wine going to be, and how much do you want to make? What's your capacity? All those things, which makes it a very complex equation, because you also make those yield decisions. You make some of them at pruning with how many buds you leave. You make some of the things we're doing now with shoot thinning, impact yield. Then we'll go through and modify at just before veraison, which is at the beginning of August. And we don't harvest until September, October. So again, when we're talking about decision making, it's not an immediate feedback loop. And it's also really interesting when you're growing grapes and making wine, because there's so many, it's such a complex system with so many different inputs, that you can make a decision this year and get one result and everything changes. So next year you pull that lever, you don't get the same response, or you don't get the same amount of response, and things change. And so that's again where it's amazing that we've done so much research here in the Yakima Valley. I actually worked at WSU when I was in high school, doing wine grape research. And I think it's a huge asset to the industry, because when I wrote my grad thesis at UC Davis, my bibliography was maybe a little over the top. I had a 7-page bibliography, because my thesis was on, if we change all these different things in the vineyard, can we connect that to attributes in the wine? And so we modified 12 different things in the vineyard, and then made wine, and then studied the wines, and it was the culmination of an 8-year project. And so I did a lot of vineyard research, and the amount of research that comes out of Washington State, and specifically the Yakima Valley, for the size of the industry at that time was unparalleled in the world. The Australians also do a lot of research, but the research coming out of California for the size of the industry is nothing compared to the amount of research that comes out of the state of Washington. And all that research has always been focused here in the middle of the Yakima Valley, which has helped us as growers to make more informed decisions and get smarter and get better. And I mean, we did drip irrigation trials in our vineyard when we started working on things. We've done trials on canopy management. We've done temperature monitoring trials. We've had geologists come through our vineyard. So we try to bring as much science into it as we can.
I think it's all about vine balance though too. So when winemakers come to the vineyard with me and they want me to drop a lot of crop on the ground because they think that 2.5 tons is going to be better than than the 3.5 tons that we have. I really work to convince them, especially if I've got a lot of canopy to carry that fruit, that I really work hard to try to convince them to let me leave that fruit on there to balance out the vine, because it's not always the lower tonnage fruit that is the very best. It's to me, it's always about vine balance. And so if I can balance out those vines with the tons that we want to grow, that's when I think we get the best quality fruit that's out there.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Marshall. And it goes back to ageability and just so many things is just having a good vine balance, and a balance of canopy to crop load, a balance of the nutrition that's in it. And every site is going to have its own kind of equilibrium of where that's at. If it's a big steep hill and you got some old vines that are 40 years old, you try to hang 4 ton to the acre, it's just not going to ripen it probably if it's calf. But the balance for that probably be in that 2.5 ton to the acre, and in a given vintage, things can be different. So you have a little bit cooler vintage, and so you're always trying to kind of estimate, like where we are right now. We're looking at it. Well, we look like pretty much an average year. It's kind of where we can kind of, you can't see too far ahead, but you're kind of trying to guess, well, what kind of crop load should we do here? And you kind of know your site. So it really is about that balance. And, you can go to the extreme on the other end. Like you say, Marshall, if you take the crop down too much, well, let's say you do that, and then your Merlot ripens about 10 days earlier because it has such a light crop. Is that beneficial? Maybe not. Maybe it is. It's that's kind of where the relationship with the winery and the grower, and it does take time to learn that, and for both of them to learn that site and what they're after.
Well, yeah, I think that's, again, when we look at the advantages of having multi-generational growers and long-term stability. I know, John, you guys do, and Marshall, I assume we do as well. We have relationships with wineries going back. David O'Reilly, who was here last week, has been buying fruit from DuBrul since before Cote Bonneville was a winery. He's been getting the same rows of fruit since 1999. And he wanted to come tonight to talk as well, especially if we're talking about diversity and how you get all these different nuances and all these different flavors. Because for David, it's like a painter's palette, and we're trying to make wines that are so tightly correlated to a sense of place. But if you're blending as one of the other options, because he makes more wines than we do, you take a little bit of this because it's got the aromatics, and you take the structure from Red Willow or from Quintessence, and you take that mid palette from Red Willow, and you put those 3 things together, that's pretty amazing. And that's a different approach, a different philosophy. And it's one of the reasons that there's so many different kinds of wine that you can make that are all spectacular and interesting out of the Yakima Valley. And Mary asked a question about rootstock that we should answer, because not only is it unique, but it's also incredibly timely. Mary asked if Washington vineyards are planted on original rootstock. Is that true? And what's the difference in flavor profile? Now, so the answer is yes. Most Washington vineyards are planted on their original rootstock. And one of the reasons for this were because when we were still as an industry learning where to grow grapes, if you had grapes down too low and you had a freeze, and it would freeze your vineyard down to the ground, it wouldn't come back up with rootstock. For those of you who aren't familiar with rootstock, there's a Native American pest called, Vitis vinifera, the species of which Cabernet, Chardonnay, Syrah, Merlot, all those things they're European grape varieties. So they evolved in Europe, and phylloxera is a Native American pest that evolved with Native American varieties like Concord and all the other Native American varieties that are not at the top of my head right now. But so somebody took a plant from the US from New York, I think, back to London on one of the beautiful English gardens. Took some phylloxera, this root louse. They come in and they eat the roots of the vines. And so the grapevines pick up all their nutrients up from the ground, and then combined with the photosynthesis that they get from the sunlight, that's where they get everything that they need to survive. So if you eat all the roots and you take away that root surface area, it functionally starves the vines. So all of the vines, Europe was devastated because European grapevines, vinifera, are not resistant to this pest, and they just came in and wiped out the entire European industry. France had no grapevines, so but because American vines evolved at the same time, they have resistance. So we have everywhere in the world, there are isolated vineyards in other parts of the world, but Chile and Washington are the only regions where everything is planted on native roots or on their own rootstock. Everywhere else, because of phylloxera, you have to plant on grafted rootstock. And one of the rootstock can be an advantage because depending on where they found the roots, you can have rootstocks that go down deep and are very deep rooting and will pull up a lot of water. So if you have thick soils and you put a rootstock that is invigorating and makes your plant bigger, then you get really big. I think John was saying last week, you get really big canopies and really big berries, and it was awesome. John, I want you to do that again for me. That was fantastic. But you get these massive canopies, which are the exact opposite of what you're trying to achieve with light penetration, airflow, keeping your berries small in size to the vine. And then you have other rootstocks that will stay shallow and will devigorate your vines and make them very small. So if you plant devigorating rootstocks on really, really shallow soils, like where we only get 2 tons to an acre anyway, if we planted on a devigorating rootstock, we wouldn't get any yield. So you have to match, ideally, you match your rootstock to your site, just like you would a clone or something like that. The interesting thing about own rooted vines is if you're looking for a sense of place, you don't get that influence of rootstock. And I liken it to when I was in undergrad, we had a great Russian department, and I read a lot of Russian literature. I can't read Russian. I don't know anything in Russian. So I've always read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky translated through somebody else interpreting their words. I've read good translations that are fantastic. I've read mediocre translations that I didn't like the same book. And so I think the holy grail, if I really was into it, I would learn Russian and read Tolstoy in the original Russian. That's like the ideal way to read Tolstoy. Well, this is one of the few regions of the world where you can get that expression of a sense of place from own-rooted vines. Now, I say that's a timely question as well, because last fall, there was some phylloxera found in Walla Walla, and they surveyed the state and found phylloxera much more, it's fairly widespread throughout the state. So that will begin to change. However, my hunch is that in the older plantings where the things where phylloxera doesn't thrive are really rocky sites. Like if there's a lot of phylloxera travels when heavily clay, or if you have enough clay, when the soil gets wet, it expands, and then when it gets dry, it contracts, and there's cracks, and phylloxera can travel through the cracks. And the place I worked in Australia, we had really sandy soils. So there were blocks which were pre-phylloxera. There were vines planted in the 1860s, and those vines are still producing. There were vines from 1947, and those vines are still producing. So, and they're really fascinating. I mean, those grapes were amazing. They're so good. And I think a lot of the really, really rocky conditions that we have are not conducive to phylloxera thriving. So it will be interesting to see how these hillside vineyards, the higher up you get, the less soil you get, the more rocks that there are. Those are the kind of places in the world where you have phylloxera, where you don't have phylloxera and where you have own-rooted vines. There are spots that are in Santorini in the basalt that are own rooted. So it's going to start to change, definitely at lower elevations where there's more soil. People will have to start planting on rootstocks. But again, I think it's such a unique expression of a sense of place. It's really special. But these are own rooted. They're the way they've been since the beginning. All right, let me see if there's anything else. We're getting to about an hour. So I don't know if you guys have to go, if you want to wind this up. If you have a bunch more questions, let me know. Put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A. I'm not going to answer where I learned bibliography skills. I've read so many papers, you wouldn't even imagine. John,
I think there was a question on like contract deal. We do both by the ton or by the acre. The stuff that's really low yield, we're usually by the acre contracts. The stuff that's moderate or a lot of your younger blocks, I don't know. We'd prefer to be by the ton, and our emphasis is quality. So we're in it for the long run. So we'll take yields down and where we think it needs to be, and work with the wineries on that. So.
Yeah, and that's us too. We're by the acre and we're by the ton both. It depends on some of the wineries we work with. We actually planted the varietal, the trellis system, everything that they wanted, and so we've got long-term contracts with them, and they're by the acre. And then a lot of the small wineries that we work with, we do that by the ton.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we found that our acreage contracts are really good for our long-term growers as well, or for our long-term winemakers as well, because you have years like 2011 where the fruit was beautiful, but the yields it was a really cold year and our yields were very low. And on a tonnage, I mean, we spent a lot of passes and a lot of time in the vineyard, and it was an expensive year to grow fruit. And then the yields were low, so it was an expensive year to buy fruit. But then in 2013, we had just beautiful conditions and yields were great. And those people, they basically paid the same amount of fruit for the acre, but their cost per ton, they helped us recoup some of those farming costs in 11, and then in 13, it balanced out. So it really is good for those long-term relationships, which is beneficial for all sorts of reasons. So, all right. Do we have any other thoughts? Marshall, do you want to give us a preview for next week?
Yeah, this is going to be great next week. I'm excited to talk to all of you guys about Red Mountain. So I hope we'll be able to kind of talk about the AVA, the size of the AVA, talk about a lot of the vineyards, not just Quintessence too, but and then really show you kind of what the things that we do kind of technology wise and how we farm those vineyards. For the size that we are on Red Mountain, it takes some technology to go along with it too, and just how these newer vineyards are planted with the trellis systems and the irrigation systems, and yeah, it's gonna be fun.
All right. Well, with that, I hope you're all enjoying your carriage house and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you guys. Thanks. Cheers.